Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Influence by Numbers, the Science Behind Influencer Market. Today's conversation is brought to you by Cision and powered by Onstream Media. To submit a question or comment anytime during the webinar, please click the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the Submit button. Alternately, you could submit your question via Twitter using the hashtag CisionWebinar. All questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. Also, a copy of today's presentation is available for your download. Please click on the Materials tab at the bottom of your screen to receive your copy. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Heidi Sullivan, Senior VP of Customer Service at Cision. Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Influence by the Numbers, the science behind influencer marketing. As mentioned, I am Heidi Sullivan. I'm the SVP of Client Services here at Cision. If you are tweeting, I am at HKSully. And shameless self-plug, I am also co-host of the Convince and Convert podcast, Influence Pros. So after this webinar, if you want to learn even more about influencer marketing, we have all kinds of wonderful guests, including the wonderful woman I am about to introduce. Carrie Morgan is the founder and president of Rock the Status Quo, and also the author of the book Above the Noise. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend checking it out. It is a must-read and gives very practical tips on what you can walk away with and implement immediately. Carrie is a digital PR consultant, author, and speaker. She's a 20-year veteran of agency and corporate marketing for clients like American Express Financial, Fidelity, Healthways, Sun Health. The list goes on with a unique branding and interactive background. Above the Noise was published by Motivational Press in 2016, and Carrie is a top 1% influencer, a top 5% LinkedIn user, co-moderator of the largest local Facebook group for PR professionals in the country, and moderator of PR Pro Chat, which is one of the industry's longest-running Twitter chats. So not sure if she has any spare time to do anything else with that resume, but welcome, Carrie. We're excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
For those of you who are tweeting, just a couple of other quick housekeeping items. We will be using the hashtag CisionWebinar, that's CISION webinar. We'll be monitoring questions there. Carrie has been kind enough to offer a very exciting prize today. So the person who sends the most tweets about today's webinar will win an autographed copy of Above the Noise, Carrie's book. So get to tweeting, hop out there, and share your thoughts. Any questions that come through Twitter or that you submit through the Q&A, we will try to get to either as we go or towards the end. So please let us know your thoughts. We want to make this as beneficial as possible for you. So let's dive into influencer marketing and what this is all about. And I always call this like the yeah, duh slide. We get it. Our jobs are that we all want to get our audience to do something. But I think it's really important as we start to look at this gigantic rise of influencer marketing, and 2016 is the year of influencer marketing, to understand why we're actually doing all of this, right? Carrie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on inspiring action here.
Well, influencer marketing is so important, and there's so much buzz about it today, but I think it's important to keep it in perspective, too, that it's a part of your strategy, a part of your outreach and in public relations, your online visibility. It's not the only thing that you have going, and it's a wonderful tactic to integrate in with other things that you're doing so that everything you're doing has better reach, more visibility, more return on your investment, whether that's time or money or whatever. And influencer marketing can be extremely powerful. It's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. And, I think you bring up a really good point. as we start talking about how this is all part of the marketing and PR mix, one of the stats that I've read recently is that PR pros and marketers are producing 3 times the content than they were 5 years ago, but they're getting less visibility and engagement to that content. And so influencer marketing is a great way to enhance your content marketing. And as you start to look at these different strategies, they all really tie in together. But I think when we talk about influencer marketing, the biggest thing is I think there's a tendency to think of it as a push mechanism of here's the tweet that I want someone to send, here's what I want them to post on Instagram so that I can broadcast my message. And beyond that, what we really want to do is inspire action. This is an evolution of word of mouth marketing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I totally love what you said, because we tend to approach influencer marketing, I think, from a me perspective, and that's exactly what makes it not work. It doesn't resonate when you reach out to influencers looking to them to do something for you. Nothing happens because they're bombarded with that all day, every day in massive volume, and it's a turnoff, frankly. If you approach it from, you know, what can I do for them first, and then start to build that relationship and build value so they see you as a part of their community, and then, you know, and then the doors kind of open for your ask. It's a world of difference, and I get pitched constantly every day for guest posts, for people wanting me to share their content, things like that. And even today, even though really content marketing, you know, how many years are we into it? It's not new anymore, right? We're 6-7 years in easily to the popularity of it. People still are talking about best practices, but they're not really doing them. And I think that goes into our topic about the science of it, is considering those parts of it, not just leaping in and sending that pitch or, you know, asking for something, but thinking it through really deeply.
I really love, Carrie, that you are able to bring the perspective of both being an influencer but then also being a marketer, and I think it gives you a unique perspective in being on both sides of this and really trying to understand the most effective strategies. And, you know, as you were talking about building relationships, a lot of times, you know, I get the question of how do you even have the time to do all of this? It seems almost impossible to really have the time. One of the very simple things that I do is working in the world of PR. I have probably 30 to 40 influencers that I really enjoy. So I have a Twitter list of those people, and then I also have an RSS email that I receive with all of their blog posts. And I can't read 25 blog posts a day, but I will scan all the headlines.
Oh, come on.
Well, in all my spare time, Carrie. So, yeah, but I'll read 1 or 2 a day, and, you know, and any interesting headline, I'll comment on a blog post, I'll retweet it, I'll see what people are tweeting, and it's literally 10 to 15 minutes a day. I pop in twice a day. But then, like Carrie mentioned, when you do have an ask, they're like, oh, yeah, my buddy Heidi, who's always reading my blog and following what I'm saying. And I think it's an easier strategy then to begin to build those relationships if you're able to time box it and find ways to kind of build out those lists and make that happen.
Yeah, if there's any science to it, it's that you have to immerse yourself in their community first, not last. And I think it's interesting today because a lot of marketers are generalists. So maybe they do some PR, they do, you know, some SEO, they do some advertising, they do a little bit of everything. And that creates this interesting time crunch. But if you can't immerse yourself in the communities online of the influencers you want to build something with, then you're invisible to them, and then you're going to them for this ask, but you've given absolutely nothing to them. Maybe you don't follow them, you've never shared a post of theirs, you've never commented, and maybe you don't even follow them on social media platforms. You know, it's demanding something with giving nothing back, and you just have to make time. Even if you're a generalist that does, you know, juggles 100 balls, you have to invest those small pieces of time on a consistent basis to be in those communities. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's shift a little bit and talk about what has really fueled the evolution of influencer marketing. And, you know, I think if we look at the world of PR and what our world was 10 years ago, we had a silver bullet, right? We needed to get a mention in major media outlets. You want to be covered in the New York Times, or you want to be mentioned in the evening news. And if you're able to do that, you're able to reach your audience. But what we've seen is this fracturing of media where people aren't necessarily picking up the newspaper. People aren't necessarily tuning into the exact same newscast. And so there are a variety of voices that resonate with a particular community, and our challenge is finding ways to get to that audience, because traditional methods, while still very important, can't do it alone.
I think the noise level has completely changed from the journalist side too, because 10 years ago when we were doing PR, only PR people did PR, right? So it was a small pool that they had to deal with as a journalist, only so many emails. And you know, as online education and content, as all of that exploded, suddenly everybody is saying, oh, I can do PR. It's no big deal. I'll just learn how to do it in this blog. And boom, see, I'm an expert at PR now. And every entrepreneur wants to do it. You know, it's a massive pool of people some with a lot of experience, some with zero experience, and everything in between that are suddenly pitching these journalists. And they're just, you know, under a tsunami of crap, frankly.
Can someone please tweet out tsunami of crap?
Okay, I can rephrase that a little more tactfully.
I love it.
True. It's true because everyone is pitching journalists now, and you know there's vast differences in levels of experience behind those pitches, and even if they're coming from agencies, you know, agencies we all know do only so much training. It's left to the employee to really train themselves, and so I think that has been a huge turnoff for journalists, so that, you know, with that much noise, you have to turn it out just to get your work done, right? So so that's had a massive impact too.
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I think what we've really seen is the end of news as an event. It's not reading the newspaper on the train on your way to work in the morning. It's not necessarily saying, honey, stop doing the dishes. It's time to turn on the 9 p.m. newscast. You're still ingesting that content. However, it's aggregated and customized and delivered to you in myriad ways, whether it's through your Facebook feed or in an, you know, aggregated email alert. And we're doing it throughout the day. You're not finding out about the news just because you read the New York Times today. You've already heard the news. You already knew it. And the challenge, I think, for us as marketers and PR pros is that we need to find all these different channels to begin to identify that audience. I always like to quote an article that Brian Stelter wrote in the New York Times, like back in 2008, where everyone was freaking out during the presidential election that young people were only getting their news from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And this college student said, no, if the news is that important, it will find me. And I think that's been the fundamental shift, right, is that we're not out seeking the messages. The messages are just coming to us via our mobile devices all day long in real time. That's awesome as consumers. We don't have to do anything. As marketers and PR pros, that presents a real challenge. And influencers have started to develop voices that are able to compete with that tsunami of noise.
It's interesting, and it's also taken away our ability to control that message too, because, you know, it's like the telephone game. If something is on Facebook, you know, people will read the headline and all of a sudden comments and viewpoints start exploding when they didn't read the article, they just read the headline. And I mean, there's so much less ability to manage what happens with our news. You just have to, you know, do what you can to lead it and be involved in those conversations. But it's like, you know, a slinky. It can go in any direction and any platform.
For sure. So as we start talking about why this has all happened, I do want to highlight one particular trend, and I've been hearing this more and more on the podcast when we start looking at trends, and that's the trend of micro-influencers. I think when influencer marketing first evolved, we were all like, I have to get Kim Kardashian and Justin Bieber to talk about my news. And, like, I want the biggest audience with the people with the largest megaphone. And what we're really finding is that the people who are able to inspire action are actually more average influencers with a more normal following. However, they're really engaged with their community. These are people that are talking back and forth with them and are looking to them to give branding advice. And so what you're looking at here is, Cision has a media and influencer database. And when we first started adding influencers and bloggers, what we noticed is that it was the reverse of the journalists that we were tracking. So we have like 1,500 topics that we look for people to cover. And 75% of traditional journalists would cover one of our 17 first-tier topics, which you can see here. It's like building and construction, business and finance, travel, technology, So they would say, I am the beauty editor, I am the travel writer, I am the producer for our automotive segment. What we found when we started tracking bloggers and influencers was that it was the absolute reverse, that 77% covered a very specific niche topic. So instead of covering travel, they cover backpacking in Thailand with a disability, or instead of covering fashion and beauty, they cover only vegan footwear. And when you're able to get those qualified eyeballs, those that truly engaged niche audience, we're really able, instead of looking for these gigantic followings, able to hyper-target in ways we've never had access to before.
I think that's important, and I think it's been kind of an evolution, as we've become more sophisticated at using social media and at understanding, what types of content creates ROI and things like that. We've discovered that the old shotgun approach of splattering it out at all these general influencers wasn't driving any real ROI, and it was just too difficult. And the more noisy, online environments got, the more we all discovered, hey, when I reach out to these, micro-influencers, things happen. And if I identify the micro-influencers most relevant to my brand, my product, the audience I'm trying to reach, well, holy cow, amazing things happen. So let's do more of that, and it's really been that evolution of us as sophisticated marketers learning how to make it work, I think. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. And since this is a by-the-numbers webinar, I'm just going to quote a study that Twitter and Analect did, which is that Twitter users report a 5.2 times increase in purchase intent when they're exposed to promotional content from influencers. So as we're talking about this hyper-targeting, if you find the right influencers who are passionate, who are ambassadors and advocates for your brand, what they're really doing is inspiring the audience that's, below the surface in the iceberg here. They're just the tip of the iceberg, and it truly does influence buying decisions.
What I think will happen as kind of the next wave will be not just working with micro-influencers, but really identifying out of those micro-influencers, some have incredible ability to raise the bar because they know how to drive action from what they're endorsing or supporting or talking about, and some don't. And so we're learning how to identify which ones have real audience, versus just a claim, and which ones have actual engagement on their blog, so there's conversations happening and meaningful dialogue that adds to that believability. That's kind of the side of it, I think, that's growing, because we've learned about the micro-influencers. Now we're applying it and taking it to the next level for how it can truly work for our specific goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the theory behind influencer marketing. And for those of you who are Malcolm Gladwell fans, I mean, this was probably a decade ago when he first started talking about hush puppies, right? And not the delicious fried balls of dough, but the shoes themselves. And the fact that there were a couple of really cool club kids in Brooklyn who started wearing hush puppy shoes, and it was kind of an ironic trend, and all of a sudden cool kids in other parts of New York and then cool kids in other parts of the country and then not so cool kids were all wearing hush puppies, and their sales exploded by 5,000% in 2 years. Now, Gladwell then says, so here's what it is. You need to find these very few cool kids who are particularly influential, and that the success of any kind of social epidemic is heavily dependent on the involvement of people with a particular and rare set of social gifts. Now, I bought this hook, line, and sinker because I felt like I knew those people. I felt like my brother was one of those guys. Like, he gave me an Amy Winehouse album before she ever made it to the U.S., and he has been obsessed with the impending zombie invasion long before The Walking Dead ever came out. However, the problem is that he didn't necessarily predict the popularity of, say, vampires and Twilight. So it becomes challenging when you start looking at utilizing influencers to create a social epidemic. So then there's this guy, Duncan Watts, right? And he's been with Columbia, with Yahoo, with Microsoft. He's done a ton of studies on this. And he says trends are unpredictable. And he took a group of 14,000 people and had them rank 48 different songs from their favorite to their least favorite. And 7,000 of those people, so half the group, they were able to see what other people were ranking. And there were people who ended up being influential, and all of a sudden, everybody all voted for the same number one, and everybody's number 48 was all number 48. On the other half of the group, he didn't let anybody see anybody else's ranking, and there was no clear number one. Somebody's number one was somebody else's number 48. So he says a rare bunch of cool influencers just don't have that power, and when you test the way marketers say the world works, it falls apart. So it's really presented us with these two different views, and I think what's important here when we look at who's really right is that trends still begin with a small few people and are spread by those people who have connections and can inspire action. And so what's most important for us as a takeaway is to say it's not just going to be a finite list of people that I predict that Carrie Morgan will be the one person to set off my trend and everything will blow up and I will be the next Hush Puppies. But instead, understand who Carrie, her community, the other influencers in your space are, know that influencers are talking to each other, and that's how you can really become engaged with a community and not look for that silver bullet influencer.
I think there's different levels of how influencers talk to each other, too. Like, they talk to other influencers, sure, but they talk to their audience, too, and it's helpful before you decide on an influencer that you think is right for a specific campaign you are launching, for example, is to look at that influencer and the habits online, what kind of digital presence, but what they talk about. Because if what they talk about and how they do it doesn't fit with your goals, then even though that influencer may have incredible reach, it's probably not a good fit for you. You know what I mean? So,
yeah. It is really important to look at the personality. You know, like if you're a very family-friendly brand, the right influencer for you is probably not a nightclub DJ in Miami, you know. And you have to find people who have a voice that resonates with your community and with the message you're trying to convey. Because as Carrie highlighted earlier, you really lose control over your message. And as marketers and PR pros, that's a tough pill for us to swallow, right? Because that's our whole gig, is we create the message and we own the message. And all of a sudden we're saying, it's really okay, we're going to let them come up with the message here. And so, yeah, I mean, even on the podcast, I think when we look at the most effective influencer campaigns, and we've had a few influencers on the podcast, and what they highlight every time is that what they get the most engagement when they actually are able to craft their own message. When they work with brands who say, okay, well, in exchange for, product or money or, whatever, I want you to post this very specific phrase, audiences don't tend to respond to that as much as an organic message, even if it is fully disclosed as a paid sponsorship. If it really sounds like it's coming from the voice of the influencer, that's when it's the most compelling and really starts to influence a community.
How compelling something is and how much influence it has is fascinating, too, because there's so many different levels of influencer marketing. It's not just one thing, oh, gee, I'm going to do influencer marketing. It's everything from, okay, I want to place some guest blog posts on blogs that are highly trafficked in hope of bringing, traffic over to my blog. Or there's so many different ways of influencer marketing. And I think sometimes not enough thought is put into something beyond that cool label of an influencer marketing campaign. It sounds great to the board of directors or whatever, but take it a lot deeper and identify, okay, exactly what is this? What am I trying to accomplish? And what, can these specific influencers make that happen? So get into the down and dirty details, and that's the science of it. That's where it starts to really become magical, I think.
Absolutely, and I think you hit on a great point that there is such a variety and breadth to the type of influencer marketing that you can do, whether it's utilizing influencers to create content that you can curate where you're kind of doing user-generated content from influencers, whether it's to get a message out, whether it's to build ambassadors or have someone really start to understand your brand. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can implement an influencer marketing campaign, and it doesn't all fit into one neat little box of here's how you do it, step 1, 2, 3, 4.
It doesn't, and it's very different based on whether it's consumer or whether it's B2B and the industry even. I mean, there's so many factors that impact it. So it's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, and as you bring that up, I think it's perfect to go to the next slide here because, we're talking about influencer marketing, but I think there's kind of a land grab right now of does influencer marketing live in PR or does it live in marketing? And I think there's arguments to be made on both sides. In my podcast, I clearly am on the earned media side. I'm on the PR side of building relationships with influencers and doing kind of free influencer marketing, which is a lot like traditional PR, a lot like working with journalists. My co-host is from Tap Influence, which tends to focus on paid influencer marketing. And what we've seen is that the paid part is typically used for B2C brands, for consumer packaged goods. A lot of times when you see, a YouTuber talking about fashion and beauty, this is coming from the marketing team. If you are paying, it does require full disclosure. It can be as simple as an influencer saying #ad on their Instagram photo. But there are some stories from Nordstrom and a couple other brands who have been, the FTC has definitely been taking a look and saying you have to make sure that you're doing full disclosure here that this is an ad. And a lot of this need was developed by the growth of ad blockers. So when you look over the past 2 or 3 years, the number of consumers that now have ad blockers on their phones, on their computers, traditional marketing tactics are not getting through to consumers like they used to, and influencers have become that new channel. On the flip side, from PR, this need was really developed by what we were talking about earlier with the fracturing of media and needing a new way to reach our audiences. It does tend to be organic based on interest and is most effective for B2B. I'm not saying that B2B can't do paid and B2C can't do organic earned marketing, influencer marketing, but that's typically how we've seen that slice up. Have you experienced the same thing, Carrie?
Well, I think it goes back to the goals of the influencer that kind of helps create that split too, right? Because when you look at a consumer-based influencer, say they're a mommy blogger, for example, their goal, why they're an influencer, is to bring traffic to their website because they're making revenue off their paid ads and clicks on those ads, right? So their focus is pure revenue. But if you look at B2B, oftentimes the goal of any influencer in B2B is usually to build credibility, to enhance their reputation and showcase their expertise, right? So they're not focused on driving mass traffic to that blog and finding ways to make money out of the content on that blog. They're looking to build reputation and do kind of less tangible things that aren't usually as directly tied to revenue, and I think that matters to understand that.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good time for us to talk through a couple of case studies here, just to see effective campaigns, and I do see that in the Q&A that Sarah asked for an example of a B2B influencer marketing campaign, and we will absolutely get there. First, though, I'll give you an example of a B2C paid influencer marketing campaign. And this is Dorothy Kern that we're looking at here. She is a dessert blogger, and she writes the blog Crazy for Crust. And what you see here is a sponsored post from Challenge Butter. And this is no-bake strawberry pretzel salad pie. I thought it looks pretty amazing. And what you'll see is that she does highlight in the post that it is sponsored by Challenge. If you want to check out their promotion, you can click here. And in her ingredients, she uses Challenge butter and Challenge cream cheese instead of just regular butter and cream cheese. The reason I'm highlighting this as an example is when we're talking about allowing an influencer to own the message, there's no one in Dorothy's audience who is going to say, oh, this is a paid promotion, I'm not going to make strawberry pretzel salad pie. This is still Dorothy's recipe, but it's a really organic way. And we had Dorothy on the podcast, and she was saying that she's really very selective about the brands that she works with, and Challenge happens to be made in her home state, so she was a big fan of their butter. And then, of course, I'm in the grocery store a week ago, and Challenge was on sale, and I'm a Land O'Lakes girl, and I thought, well, Dorothy likes it, maybe I'll try Challenge butter. But this is, it's one of those organic things where this is really where the recommendations come through, even though you see right clearly at the bottom that this post was sponsored by Challenge butter, but all opinions are Dorothy's own.
A great case study, love it.
To the question of a B2B case study, I'll tell you a little bit about what Leoden at Top Rank did with Curata and Content Marketing Institute to drive registrations for Content Marketing World. And one of the reasons I really like this one is that there is some very clear ROI here in being able to figure out exactly what your objective is, and we'll talk a little bit more about measure it later. But what they did, and this is an example of utilizing influencers to curate content, is they came up with 3 different ebooks with recommendations on content marketing strategies from influencers. So they approached influencers in the content marketing space, asked for thoughts, compiled a really nice ebook, and then distributed it. And of course, what you have is those influencers then sharing the content as well. So it kind of has a dual purpose on the influencer side. This was not a paid campaign, and it resulted in over 200,000 ebook views, 4,000 downloads, and 1,000 leads that were captured. So they really did truly know how they reached their objectives by looking at how it drove registrations to the Content Marketing World Conference. And so that's what I think, Carrie, you were highlighting earlier of knowing the objective of a campaign is so important so that when you do go back to your boss or your board and say, here's how my influencer marketing campaign performed. It's beyond just the number of retweets that you got. It's beyond the number of views on a particular blog. You're able to tie that back to business goals.
And it's even better if you can take that total leads captured and follow it through enough to say, you know, out of those leads, here's how many purchased a product, or here's how many converted in some way that adds to the bottom line. That's a wonderful thing to do. It's hard. It's very difficult because often, you know, PR pros, we don't even have access to that kind of data. We have to lean on our clients to track that and give it back to us, but it's important. What I was saying earlier, too, is it's not just important to understand the goals for the piece of content or the campaign, but the specific goals of the influencer, because if you can pitch something that feeds into their goals, it's a slam dunk. If you don't understand their goals and you pitch something, odds are that your pitch will go completely flat. So it's important on both sides of the fence.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One more case study that I'll throw at you here, and then we can get into some cool stuff about measurement. Joni Lay is a blogger at Lay Baby Lay, which is a lot of interior design and stuff for kids. And Home Depot really wanted to start engaging the mom audience. You know, we know that there's a lot of guys who go to Home Depot. There is a lot of stuff that moms can do as well at Home Depot. So what they did, instead of necessarily paying Joni, is they made over her entire kitchen. And there are YouTube videos that have hundreds of thousands of views all about her kitchen makeover, which she then shared on her blog. And she had a community that was very excited to see this. So this is a great example of really giving back to an influencer and knowing that this is really a two-way street in relationships to be able to highlight your brand. So, Carrie, let's talk a little bit about measurement. As you've done some influencer campaigns, what do you think are the really important things to look at?
Well, I always try to start with what the goal is, because that gives you a more natural path to what you're going to measure. If you just say, I want to do an influencer campaign, and you get started, and then it's in full motion, and you're like, okay, now how am I going to measure this? You know, it's a lot harder to make anything accomplished that way. It's very, very difficult. And that's also a poor way to choose your influencers. But when you start with a specific goal, a business goal that you want to happen, and then you match up the influencers with it, you match up goals with it, then it's natural. So for the case study you just did, for example, for Home Depot, I mean, I don't know any marketing people at Home Depot, but I would venture a guess that it has to do with that separate kitchens department that they have where they sell appliances and cabinets, right? And so their ultimate goal was probably to sell more cabinets by way of bringing more traffic into the website or making the phone ring. So knowing that in advance makes it fairly simple to say, okay, well, now I know what I need to measure because it's a natural part of this campaign, right? So I think that's an important way to start it. One of my fallback things that I always measure is I'm a huge Google Analytics fan, and website traffic, since I focus on building online visibility for my clients, that's what I do. One of the biggest ways I measure that is, okay, am I bringing them to the website? So every campaign I do I bring them to the website, and then do I have them do something once they're on the website? So looking at that Google Analytics data is fantastic, because you can say, okay, these 3 blogs brought these many click-throughs to my site, and this one did nothing. Okay, that was a fail, but it gives you an idea of what's going on with the campaigns. It's a good starting point.
I think that's a great point, and it really gets to these 2 things to measure, right? So you're measuring individual content campaigns, but then you're also looking at what works over time. And that really helps you to iterate and figure out what's working, and that's that periodic reporting and analysis. So you might have a dozen campaigns running over a couple of months, but bringing that all together and looking at the overall moving of the needle. I do see we have one question from Jasmine that's really related to this particular part of the discussion, which is what's a tool or application you can use to track a marketing campaign through to the sale from seeing total leads captured. And the MarTech revolution, I think, has really given us the opportunity to look at the ROI of campaigns. So marketers, they used to say, hey, 100,000 people drive past this billboard every day. But we have no idea, like, how many people actually look at it, and then based on who's looking at it, who actually makes a buying decision. Now that we have digital access, they can say, I sent this email campaign. There were 47 click-throughs and 10 downloads, and then 2 people eventually bought based on this email campaign. So all of a sudden, marketing is this profit center. They have this budget, and they can say, but I'm bringing in this much revenue. And PR hasn't quite gotten there yet, but I will say that a great place to start is just to go over to the other side of your team and go talk to your marketing analytics person, whether they have, Marketo or Salesforce or Eloqua or whatever they're using. What I've found in a lot of discussions and talking to some decisions customers is when they actually do that, a lot of times PR campaigns and influencer marketing campaigns, the marketing team is like chalking that up to an anomaly. Like, we don't know why traffic spiked last Tuesday because PR and marketing aren't talking to each other. They're not aware that happened. And it's why integration is so important, that the data probably already exists. Even using date correlations can really help you. But I agree with Carrie. Google Analytics should be your BFF, and is a great way to directionally get an idea.
I have kind of a personal case study to share related to that, too. And I think it's so easy for us to stop at the vanity metrics, like, ooh, that reach number is so impressive, we'll measure with that, or just the really low-lying fruit ways to measure something. But it can be incredibly deceiving. And in your intro for me, you mentioned my PR Pro chat, and that was a Twitter chat that I started 3 years ago, and it was a foundation part of marketing my book, right? So I built that because I was building audience that I hoped would buy the book when it came out. So that was the end goal. And if I had just used vanity metrics, it was tremendously successful because by the time I hit the 3-year mark, I was reaching 3 million, 10 million, really impressive sounding numbers. And that sounds fantastic, doesn't it? It sounds amazing. But then when I stopped to look at conversion, I'm like, okay, did it sell books? Did it drive blog subscribers? It completely did not. And that was a revelation. That was completely unexpected, but it was such a powerful lesson that the metrics have to fit what you're trying to accomplish, and if you stop at too simple of a metric, you're not learning what's truly important. So that was a big lesson for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love that example because I think, as PR pros, I remember my first job in PR, it was an internship, and I was given a bunch of newspaper clips and a ruler to figure out the ad equivalency value, and it's like that was my big ROI. We've garnered $80,000 in coverage this year. But
even my dog barked at that one.
I have these dirty little secrets from 20 years ago.
I know.
But I think what you're really describing is exactly this, right? Is that we need to set benchmarks and objectives. So, Carrie's describing one way of like, am I driving conversions? Maybe you have a terrible reputation, and what you're trying to do is really start changing that reputation and how people talk about you. So then the way that you measure that is by looking at the tone of all of your mentions over time. And you can start to say, okay, we went from 50% negative mentions to 30% negative mentions, and we've started to change the conversation. Maybe you want to get more brand awareness. A great way to look at that is look at your share of voice against your competitors. Do you have 10% of the conversation happening about you? And if you say, I want to change that to 15% over the next 3 months, you have those benchmarks, and then like Carrie says, you find out what works. What doesn't work, you say, okay, scrap that campaign. I'm going to focus way more on Facebook or whatever it happens to be. But as you start to engage with influencers, as much as this is called the science behind influencer marketing, there is no silver bullet. There's no guarantee that one thing is going to work. And that's why iteration becomes so important in this.
It's critical. You got to keep testing things and changing do more of what works, do less of what doesn't work. And I think that's where, it's easy to fall flat as you're measuring, but then nothing's happening really with what you're measuring. It's just not taken to that next level of scrapping what you need to scrap and moving on with new things. So important. You mentioned reputation monitoring, and I think that is so important, and it's something companies still aren't really taking very seriously. And I'm not talking about reputation management, which is really an SEO tactic where there's poor reviews and they're ranking really high on page 1 of Google, and reputation management is the process of pushing that stuff down with better things above it. But reputation monitoring instead is it's watching what people are saying about you, and it's not just doing the easy monitoring, which is when someone tags you on Facebook or Twitter so that it automatically lands in your notifications. It's about all those conversations that are silently happening that don't easily fall on notifications. So you need to watch for the untagged things too, and understanding those conversations and setting those benchmarks to change the conversations and to be involved in those conversations is so important.
Absolutely. And if you do want to find out more about reputation management, there's this great book by Carrie Morgan called Above the Noise, and she's got an entire chapter on it.
And I did not pay you to say that. That was brilliant.
You did not, but it's absolutely true. It's absolutely
that was
true.
awesome.
It's a great step-by-step guide, absolutely. So with that, we have a bunch of wonderful questions coming in, but first of all, we're going to quickly throw a polling question up to you. So please feel free, click a yes or no if you'd like to learn more about the insights that Cision provides into how influencer efforts can impact your bottom line. And then while we do that, I am also going to look for our autographed copy of Above the Noise winner, and it is Suzette Kattenhofen, who is at WebDiva91. So, Suzette, it is on the way to you. We will DM you for more info, and congratulations.
You were rocking out the tweets, girl. That was awesome. And some really great questions, too. Nicely done.
Now, I do know that one of her questions was, for those of you who do not have your book, where can we get a copy? We know where Suzette's getting the copy, but, Carrie, why don't you tell everybody else a little bit more about where they can find your book?
Above the Noise is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, so you can just head over to either one of those sites and buy it. Should be easy to find. Bookstores, I'm not sure about that one, so it depends where you live. But I would try online. And it's a little bit discounted, which is always awesome.
I'm a Kindle girl through and through. I have stopped turning pages, so.
Yeah. Well, I pretty much buy everything on Amazon, but I'm split. Most of my business books I get hard copy. Most of my beloved trashy fiction books I get electronic. So.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's take a few questions here. Carrie, I'm curious to hear your answer to this one. Which social media platform do you see as the up-and-coming one to be using, and why?
That's a question that so many people ask, and I think it's so easy for clients to want to do whatever platform is being buzzed about the most, whatever the hot platform of the moment is. But I think it's important to sometimes just look past the sparkly, sexy platforms of the moment, the product du jour, if you will, and say, okay, who am I trying to reach and what platform are they on? Because Snap is a great example, Snapchat, which is Snap now, is a great example. It's like there's so much conversation about Snap, but what's interesting is it's still got a fairly small percentage of the population that's on it, and when you split the demographics by industry, you want to make sure that your industry, the one that you're targeting, is that a good platform for? And it may or may not be. Like, it's great for beauty, but maybe it's not so good for automotive, or, it's important to look deep enough at a platform and at your specific target audience in relation to that platform. I've never really been a fan of being pressured to be on all the platforms, and I think that's something that's very prevalent in our industry, especially, as marketers building personal brands. There's a lot of pressure to be on every single platform there is, but most of us, unless we have a team of 10 behind us that are supporting it, we can't do that. We can't do a good job of it. And I'm a huge fan of picking the platforms that are most relevant for your specific audience and doing a hell of a good job on that platform. It might be one, it might be three, it might be all of them, depending on your team, but don't bite off more than you can chew and do really well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, so I guess if I did have to pick a platform, there's two things that I will highlight. One, Cision started doing a little bit of Facebook Live, and Facebook really wants Facebook Live to take off. I mean, you get a notification anytime anyone you know is going live, and we found that we were getting 40 times the engagement that we were for anything else we had on Facebook. So I will highlight that if you have a following on Facebook, if you do have a presence on Facebook, that's actually a great place right now to utilize Facebook Live, because Facebook is going to push it out there and it's going to get visibility. So it's a nice way to amplify it. The only other thing I'll highlight is that we continue to see a growth in video. So whether you're talking about YouTube or Vine or anything else, having a video strategy, thinking about video when you're in terms of influencer marketing, that's where influencers are really building engagement, is on the video side. And I think as PR pros, we tend to be a little bit afraid of video. Yeah,
it's not easy to control, yeah. It's live video, too. It's not just that it's a video, but it's live video, and the risk goes up with that, I think. It makes us all a little bit leery.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we've been talking about controlling your message, and it's hard. So
what's fascinating to me is YouTube launched YouTube Live recently, and I just don't see a lot of chatter about that. And I find that interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, and you never know how stats change, but YouTube consistently has had a bigger volume of traffic than Facebook does. Although people don't hit it as often, it's more people. But there's so much chatter about Facebook Live and next to nothing about YouTube Live. I find that really interesting. I want to try YouTube Live. I've not had a chance yet, but it's definitely at the top of my list.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I hadn't even thought of that, but I also haven't heard much, and I've heard so much about Facebook Live. And I do feel like I've seen so many people utilizing Facebook Live, and I haven't really engaged a lot with anyone using YouTube Live. So you and I'll have to do a test, and we can report back to the group on the effectiveness.
Let's do that. We'll do a YouTube show. Yeah.
All right.
Sold.
Carrie and Heidi go live on YouTube. Done.
Well, let's circle back just really quick on that question before we move on, because choosing your platform, I think it's important. It's very easy to just choose what people talk about the most, what appears to be most popular. But if it's not connecting to your specific audience, then it's really a wasted investment of your time. So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think we do have this shiny object syndrome of saying, everybody's on Snapchat, I have to be on Snapchat, and without really knowing what you're measuring at the end. So Dale, back when we were talking about changing news sources, was saying this is particularly pertinent in the week when Vice News has become a nightly newscast, perhaps to reach a younger demographic, but perhaps because cable news like CNN is so focused on single themes, not the spectrum of daily news. Do we have any views on this? And I think from my perspective, Dale, this is very similar to the micro-influencer discussion of a demand for more niche topics and in-depth dives into news. What we don't see and what we do lose by the end of news as an event is the more in-depth investigation and coverage of our particular topic. And I do think that what we're finding is that niche topics and things that cover something very specifically or can highlight something to a very different community is on the rise because we have been inundated with single themes.
I also see a big loss in the area of local news, which makes me very sad because as PR pros, we often have local clients, not necessarily national clients, and there's fewer and fewer places to showcase them as local news really disappears, and they start to, include more national news coverage in newspapers and things like that. I mean, just the Arizona Republic alone, it's got a lot more AP content now than than local content, and that makes me sad.
Yeah. And you know what we've seen is that in traditional news outlets, even in major cities like Philadelphia and Chicago, there are news agencies that are doing a lot of B-roll or background research for local coverage that is then shared by a bunch of different outlets. So it's not even competing local news anymore. It's all being sourced by the same person who ends up doing the interview.
Well, they're also sourcing news by letting social media popularity dictate what becomes the news, which means the same Trump-Clinton overkill we see on Facebook is suddenly becoming, what we see on other news forums too, and it's kind of making this ubiquitous effect where the news is the same everywhere you go because, and I don't like that, but it's definitely a trend. It's definitely a trend.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think we have time for two more questions here, and I'd like to get to Jill's question, which is how do we go about identifying influencers that make most sense for our goals? And one thing I want to highlight here, because this is the number one question that I get asked when I talk about influencer marketing, is Launchmetrics did a study, and 75% of professionals consider identifying the right influencer for their brand to be the biggest challenge they have in influencer marketing. So even though we're talking a lot about ROI and figuring out how to allow influencers to own the message and all of the creative, cool stuff that goes into this, identifying the influencers ends up being the biggest challenge. So I'll maybe kick it off, Carrie, with giving a shameless self-plug for Cision and our influencer database as a great place to start. To our friends at Tap Influence, they have a paid searchable database. So if you're looking for influencers that you can pay on the B2C side, they have a database, and all of the finances and everything is all handled within the app, so you don't have anything weird there. But also, if you're just dipping a toe here, I think what we were talking about with influencers talking to each other is a great place to start. So if you find or one influential person, so if your audience is PR and I know that Carrie Morgan is an influencer in PR, I'm going to start looking at who Carrie's mentioning, at who she's doing webinars with, who she's speaking with at conferences, who she's mentioning in her book. And then I start to build out that community of influencers, and I look at who they're talking to. And as you start to do that, you can start to build out that group of influencers and monitor it as it changes. So I don't know, Carrie, if you have any thoughts on identifying influencers.
Well, Google is still one of my favorite tools for that, too, because when I'm building an influencer campaign, sometimes it's local, not necessarily national. So maybe I'm looking for beauty bloggers in Arizona, for example, smaller community, smaller base, pool to use. So I'll do a simple Google search like top beauty bloggers AZ, and I'll do variations of different keyword searches, and I'll see what comes up there, and I'll check out their blogs and look at what the actual size of their audience is and kind of make a decision, okay, do they have real influence or was it just good SEO, and then I'll go to Twitter usually because it happens to be one of the platforms I feel is used most for content curation. So I look at who's doing what hashtags, who's visible, who's engaged in conversations relevant to a hashtag, that fits with the influencers I'm looking for, things like that. So I'll spend a couple hours just kind of sleuthing out who's talking and who's being talked about, and then go from there.
Absolutely. And I think the big challenge with influencer marketing, as you're hearing loud and clear, is it requires a lot of work. It requires work to find the influencers. Wow. It requires work to build the relationships. But TAP did a study with Nielsen Catalina Solutions and found that influencer marketing campaigns were providing 11 times the ROI of other methods of marketing. And so even though it's a lot of work, there is a lot of payoff at the end of this all.
And I think it's important to look at them one by one, because just because an article mentions someone as an influencer or a blogger emails you looking for opportunities to partner, those aren't necessarily good, strong signals that it's real influence. For example, I work with a client in the med spa space, and we're building a beauty blogger campaign for her, and I went to their event last week, and a blogger was there, and she was all excited about wanting to partner. And I got back to my office the next day, and I started looking into her digital presence, and I pulled up her blog, I pulled up all of her social media profiles to see how big her audience was there engagement, and it all fell flat. Her blogging was fairly poor quality, lots of typos, no comments whatsoever, and then I went to her Instagram, and it was super, super tiny, and I'm like, okay, this is a blogger with great intentions, and she is in the space that I want to reach, but she doesn't have the influence power to make anything happen for my brand, so I can't partner with her. So taking a look one by one at each influencer is a super, super important part of the process.
Absolutely. So I know we're low on time, but we'll take one more question. Before we do, I know that Dale asked whether I had any of the metrics from the Crazy for Crust Dorothy Kern example. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but if you do go to our podcast, Influence Pros, and search for Dorothy Kern, she does talk about the ROI of particular campaigns, the metrics she provides back to brands, and how they measure the effectiveness. So I think just in closing, Carrie, we have had a couple of questions regarding really how you define an influencer. If we're talking about just bloggers and online posters, if we consider traditional journalists to be influencers. And then there was another question about ambassadors versus influencers and which is more important and why. So can you tell me your thoughts a little bit about just kind of the nomenclature of all of it?
I think most people think of influencers as social media rock stars and bloggers, but I definitely agree it's a bigger space than that. Really, it can be anyone that is influencing the target audience you want to reach, whatever form that might be. I wouldn't really think of journalists as influencers per se, even though they are. Just in the way we use it and the way we create campaigns, it just doesn't really seem like a fit. It's very traditional PR,
Absolutely. And, on the topic of ambassadors, advocates, because we also talk about advocate marketing, a great case study will be on this week's episode of the podcast. We had the head of social for GoDaddy, and they actually do a lot of their influencer marketing in live at events. So it's not necessarily people who are the most influential online, but it does take it back to in real life where you can have face-to-face conversations. And that was one of those brands that was experiencing a reputation challenge. Women were not happy that they had these very racy Super Bowl ads. And they've really changed that culture, but having those conversations face-to-face at events makes a big difference. And that's when your influencers really start to become ambassadors and advocates and those loyal people who will always come to your defense and be speaking on your behalf because they are passionate about your brand.
Absolutely, and it's kind of phase two because ambassadors, advocates, those passionately loyal friends of your brand, if you will, it can be an influencer or it could be Stu next door, it could be anyone, so it's kind of a mix. But if you can win over an influencer to become a brand ambassador, that means that they believe in your mission, they love your product or service, and you've won them over too, and it's just a totally different level, I think, of engagement and of ROI, and it's powerful. I also think that we kind of throw out ambassadors and advocates as labeled out like they're the same thing, and I view them as very different types of audiences. Like a brand ambassador, I almost see as customers using and talking about your product and sharing it. And I think one example that I like that I think it was Jay used a couple of years ago it was Matt Collier, Fiskars Scissors. They had a Fiskars program. It was brilliant. And it was for scrapbooking crafters. I'm a total craft nerd, so I get that. But it was for scrapbookers and a specific community for them. So it turned customers into this powerful forum of users and brand ambassadors that talked and promoted the Fiskars Scissors brand. And that's different than a brand advocate, which sometimes is a paid campaign. It could be a sponsored activity. It's just a different level and a different kind of, organic versus less organic approach, in my opinion. So I feel like they're not the same thing.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective before. Well, unfortunately, we are all out of time. But, Carrie, I cannot thank you enough for sharing all of your insights. It is always wonderful to chat with you, and this was so insightful. Definitely go check out Carrie's book, Above the Noise. Check out the Influence Pros podcast. Thank you to CommPro and Decision, our sponsors. And most of all, thank you to all of you for tuning in. Please don't hesitate to contact us with any following questions.
Yeah, be sure to connect on Twitter if you haven't yet. That would be wonderful. And thank you, Heidi, for having me on. This was so much fun. I absolutely love doing any kind of mutual events with you. It's always a blast. So thank you.